Hello and welcome everyone to today's chapter. Today we're going to go over chapter 13, which will cover the Civil War. This is the second chapter of the Emancipation era, and this chapter is divided into three sections. The first section will cover the secession crisis, which begins shortly after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, November of 1860, and it will end when Lincoln gives his July 4th address, his call to arms. And that will begin the next section called Preserving the Union, and this will cover the first 2 years of the fighting. And then the third section, New Birth of Freedom, will cover the last 2 years of the war. So, if you want to follow along, with me, you can on our website, www.tarpeia.us, and this is chapter 13 on the compendium of our website, which is what you're looking at right now. So let's begin. So we have the secession crisis. The Union is now rapidly unraveling. It started following Lincoln's election through to the outbreak of the war itself, as Southern secession conventions withdrew from the United States and seized federal forts and arsenals across the Deep South, even as final compromises were attempted, such as the Crittenden proposals. Leaders on all sides warned of catastrophe. Buchanan pleaded for restraint. Jefferson Davis framed secession as constitutional self-defense. Alexander Stephens openly grounded the new Confederacy on slavery in his cornerstone address, and Lincoln rejected disunion while insisting he would not initiate violence. The Confederate States of America formally organized a rival government, inaugurating Davis as president, while Lincoln's own inaugural address appealed to Unionist sentiment in the border states, where secession remained deeply contested. The crisis turned to war with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in April of 1861, after which Lincoln moved cautiously but decisively to preserve federal authority. By the eve of his July 4th address to Congress, reconciliation had failed and union had fractured, and a limited crisis had become a nationwide civil war. So, the very first document that we have is actually a cartoon from Vanity Fair, which shows two sides of the results of Lincoln's election, where you have people on the left, which this represents Northern Democrat James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald, and then you have the Republican Horace Greeley. Yes, that Horace Greeley. And it depicts Horace Greeley sitting on a roof, fiddling while the city burns, which is a nod to Nero. South Carolina, on November 10th, will vote to have a secession convention. So this is just 3 days, or 3 or 4 days after the election. You have a speech against secession by Alexander Stephens. A couple of days after that, Alexander Stephens and even Jefferson Davis were both opposed to secession at first. It wouldn't be until after their states seceded that they decided to go along with secession. So I have a couple of speeches by Alexander Stephens decrying secession. Here's The Perils and Duty of the South, J.L.M. Curie, and he will argue that it is the duty of the South to fight for her Southern honor. Yeah, Mississippi votes to have a secession convention, along with Mississippi, Florida, Buchanan gives his 1860 State of the Union address, his last one, where he is talking about the perils of the Union and the secession crisis that's currently going on. How Cobb, Secretary of the Treasury, will resign over the pending secession crisis. You have Gilmer's letter to Lincoln. North Carolina Congressman John Gilmer, future member of the Confederate Congress, wrote this letter to Lincoln following his presidential election, asking him about his stance on a number of issues. This letter shows the main concerns Southerners had. The issues were 1. Abolishing slavery in D.C., 2. Using slaves in arsenals and dockyards and transferring slaves from one state or territory to another, 3. Whether Congress had the power to interfere with slavery in the states, or that he, Lincoln, would agitate against slavery or make slaves less useful or disturb the peace of owners. 4. Veto the admission of a new state simply because it allows slavery in its constitution. 5. Enforce the fugitive slave law. 6. Influence the repeal of any law in any state that conflicts with the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. So, you can easily tell that the main concern of these Southerners who are actively seceding from the Union pertains to slavery. Not a single complaint, and I mean this, not a single complaint about tariffs. It is about slavery. The issue that caused the Civil War is slavery. And I have a couple dozen documents from Southerners, from Confederate leaders, before and during the Confederacy, of them nonstop talking about and being concerned about slavery, and virtually no documents about them complaining about tariffs. Civil War was not fought over tariffs. It was fought over slavery. This is one of many documents which prove that. So, Louisiana will vote to have a secession convention. Now, these are just voting for the conventions to occur. This does not mean that they're seceding just yet, only that they will have a convention to decide whether or not they should secede. On December 12th, you have a Secretary of the State, Lewis Cass, resigns over Buchanan sending federal troops to federal forts near Charleston. So Buchanan was the one who was sending federal troops to federal forts throughout the South, not Lincoln. Buchanan began this policy. Buchanan will be against secession, although he doesn't really do much about it. Address on the secession crisis by Albert Brown. Senator Albert Brown from Mississippi gives an address on the current secession unfolding. Again, the main issue is slavery, not, of course, any financial issues like tariffs or anything like that. An address by certain Southern members of Congress on secession. Again, their main concern will be slavery. South Carolina's secession convention convenes. So South Carolina will be the first state to have its secession convention, and they will also be the first state to actually secede from the Union. You have the Crittenden Compromise. It consisted of 6 proposed constitutional amendments, the most important being slavery would be prohibited north of the 36th parallel, the Missouri Compromise line. Slavery would be protected south of that line forever. Congress would be barred from abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia as long as it existed in Virginia and Maryland. Congress could not interfere with the interstate slave trade. Existing fugitive slave laws would be strengthened and protected by constitutional amendment. this compromise is rejected by both houses of Congress. So this is not really a serious compromise that a lot of people talk about. They talk about how Lincoln supported it. First of all, Lincoln's not president, and second of all, it does not get past either house. Most people are simply just against this. So it's not as serious as what people bring it up as. South Carolina's Ordinance of Secession. Now, this is just the ordinance. The ordinances do not go into that much detail as to why they're seceding. It only declares that they are seceding. If you want to understand why they're seceding, you have to look at their declarations. You have Lincoln's letter to Alexander Stephens on the secession crisis. In it, Lincoln says that he will not threaten slavery, and so he's confused as to why the states are seceding. Like, why would they secede when he isn't threatening slavery? South Carolina's secession declaration. Now, this is the Declaration of South Carolina, which is explaining why they are seceding from the Union, as opposed to the secession ordinance, which was just saying that they were seceding. It wasn't explaining why they were seceding. You have South Carolina's address to other slave-holding states. So South Carolina is sending this open letter, this circular letter, to the fellow slave-holding states, asking them to secede from the Union and to create a new government. Buchanan refuses to meet with South Carolina commissioners who sought possession of U.S. government property. And so the states in the South will ask Buchanan to remove federal troops out of those forts, those federal forts, so that the states can assume those forts, even though those forts belong to the federal government. So a lot of people say that the North, was transgressing on the South when it was the South who was taking federal territory, which belonged to the Union. And these states, they didn't even secede yet. You Can Never Subjugate Us by Judah Benjamin, a senator from Louisiana and future Attorney General and Secretary of War for the Confederacy. Judah Benjamin explains the constitutional issues of the secession crisis, the North's denial that slaves are property, the North's refusal to protect slavery in the territories, the North's encouragement of stealing slaves from their masters, the North's attempts at making the retrieval of fugitive slaves difficult and costly, the North's rude comments of the South wanting to protect their ownership of slaves, the North's insistence on not allowing slavery in new conquered lands. Every single issue that this guy, who's not some random guy, he's a senator from Louisiana, and he becomes the Attorney General of the Confederacy and the Secretary of War for the Confederacy. So these aren't random opinions from random people. This is a key Confederate leader, and the only issue that he brings up is the issue of slavery. Nothing about tariffs. The Senate Committee of 13 will report that they could not agree on a proposed plan for reconciliation. So you have the Crittenden Compromise. That completely fails. Now you have a new attempt, and it too will also fail. So even during the secession crisis, as states are seceding from the Union, you have the last attempts at reconciliation, which all fail. State of the Country by James Thornwell. Georgian referendum to have a secession convention. So instead of the state legislature of Georgia deciding to have a state legislature, they actually have a referendum to then decide to have a state convention for secession. And so you can see 50,000 in favor of having the convention, 37,000 against having a convention. So that's pretty close. That's 13,000 votes for Georgia difference for having the convention. Not for secession, just for having the convention. So you will see when you actually look at the numbers in the South, secession was not actually that popular in the South. This is what, 40% of the voters, more like 35% of the voters being in favor of not holding a convention, a secession convention. Then you have Florida's secession convention that it convenes in Tallahassee. Georgia will seize Fort Pulaski. Alabama seizes U.S. Arsenal at Mount Vernon. Alabama seizes Forts Morgan and Gaines. Florida seizes another arsenal. Another fort, Fort Marion. The Mississippi Secession Convention convenes. Alabama Secession Convention convenes. Dangers to the Union by Buchanan. This is an address that President Buchanan gives to Congress on what he thinks is the dangers to the Union, which he's talking about the secession crisis, and he will deny a state's right to secede. Floridians try to seize Fort Barrancas, but are chased off. So Fort Sumter is not the first and or only fort that is attacked by southern states. There are many federal forts throughout the South that are attacked. So you have Mississippi's secession declaration. I wonder what the main issue that they say is going to justify secession. I wonder if it's slavery. And I wonder if they mention any other reason. Oh, wait, they don't. Mississippi's secession ordinance. And again, the difference between an ordinance and a declaration. The ordinance is just them stating that they're seceding, while the declaration is them explaining why they are seceding. Star of the West fired upon in Charleston Harbor as she was trying to land reinforcements for the Fort Sumter garrison. Louisiana seizes Louisiana seizes U.S. Arsenal at Baton Rouge, as well as Forts Jackson and St. Philip. Florida Secession Ordinance on January 10th, 1861. Alabama Secession Ordinance. Louisiana seizes U.S. Marine Hospital. Louisiana seizes Fort Pike. House Committee proposes the Corwin Amendment. This amendment would make it unconstitutional to even amend the Constitution to give Congress the power to regulate or abolish slavery. Now, this amendment will not get passed. It will not be ratified because Civil War happens. You Are Not Content by John Reagan, a representative from Texas and future Postmaster General for the Confederacy, gave the speech about 2 weeks before Texas convenes at her secession convention. Georgia Secession Convention convenes in January. Alexander Stephens, who is a Georgian, will give this speech, the Great Union speech, in the Georgia Secession Convention. And in it, he's arguing against secession. He argues that slavery is not a justifiable cause for secession, and that if the southern states do secede, that will cause a war, a civil war, and the South will lose, and it will be devastating for the South. So Alexander Stephens, one of the few people to have some semblance of common sense, and he will prophetically say that I mean, it's not that prophetic, but he will say that secession will cause civil war, and during the Civil War, the South will lose, and it'll be devastating for the South. And he's absolutely right about that. Georgia's secession ordinance. So, despite Alexander Stephens's attempt to stop Georgia from seceding, Georgia will secede anyway on January 19th, 1861, and they will pass their Declaration of Secession on January 21st, 1861. Jefferson Davis will give his farewell address to the Senate on the same day, and he will again be very he will be very reluctant to be in favor of secession. He does not believe that the issue of slavery justifies secession, and he fears that the Civil War that will follow will be devastating for the South. So, although he is in favor of preserving slavery, he is cautious that secession will be bad for the South. So, it's kind of ironic that Jefferson Davis, who will speak out against secession, and same thing with Alexander Stephens, they both spoke out against secession for their respective states. Jefferson Davis becomes the president of the Confederacy, while Alexander Stephens would become the vice president of the Confederacy. Louisiana will have its secession convention, which will convene on January 23rd, 1861. Louisiana will pass its secession ordinance on January 26th. Texas will convene their secession convention, and during the convention, they will pass the secession ordinance, a declaration, a new state constitution, and they will convene in Austin, Texas. Buchanan's message to Congress on the secession crisis. In it, he is still, he's doing, Buchanan, he's president at this time. This is before Lincoln is even president. Buchanan's still president. And he's talking to Congress, and he's saying, guys, this is not good for the Union. We need to stop this. We need to reconcile and preserve the institution of slavery in order to stop secession from continuing. And also, this will lead to war. So he's very concerned that secession will lead to war, as most people at this time are also concerned with that. However, reconciliation between the Southern Democrats and the Northern Republicans is too far gone. They've already attempted the Crittenden Compromise, and that failed. And now they've attempted the Corwin Amendment, and that will also fail as well. Kind of funny, while states are leaving the Union, you have states being added to the Union, like Kansas. And so Kansas will be admitted on January 29th, 1861, as a free state, and this will end what people call Bleeding Kansas. And so that's kind of funny how when states are leaving, there are still states joining the Union. You have State of the Union, a speech given by Thaddeus Stevens. And Thaddeus Stevens, he's a Northern Republican. He's very much in favor of abolishing slavery. And he will talk about the secession crisis and how the Union will need to fight in order to not only preserve the Union, but to abolish slavery. You have a couple people give their own take on the State of the Union. So this is another guy, Roscoe Conkling. You have Texas's Ordinance and Declaration, which they pass in the same document on February 1st, 1861. On February 4th, 1861, you have the Confederate States of America, the CSA, is officially formed in a convention with a number of the states that will join the Confederacy. You have the Peace Conference of 1861. This is yet another attempt for both the North and the South to reconcile before any fighting happens. A farewell address to the Senate by Judah Benjamin. Arkansas will seize the U.S. arsenal at Little Rock. Tennessee's referendum on having the secession convention. The people rejected the call for a convention by 69,000 to 57,000. So in the border states, people are not in favor of secession. Not yet. At least Tennessee, has a referendum, and the people vote against having a secession convention. You have Jefferson Davis is elected CSA president on February 9th, 1861. Arkansas seizes U.S. ordnance stores at Napoleon. Virginia's secession convention will convene, and they will vote against secession. So you see, Tennessee, Virginia, both border states, they both, at first, will reject to have a secession convention. You have The Philosophy of Secession, A Southern View by Leonidas Spratt. He is a Southerner, very much in favor of slavery and white supremacy. You have Jefferson Davis. He gives his inaugural address even before Lincoln gives his inaugural address. And so this inaugural address by Jefferson Davis will not mention slavery. And so a lot of people will look at this document and be like, oh, look, the conflict isn't about slavery because Jefferson Davis doesn't mention it at all. Congratulations, you found one of the very few documents from Jefferson Davis where he doesn't mention slavery. How about all the dozens of other documents from Jefferson Davis in the 12 years leading up to the Civil War where he talks about slavery and white supremacy? So you are cherry-picking history if you only look at this, at this document and say, oh, Jefferson Davis didn't care about slaves. He absolutely did. The territorial government of Colorado is established on February 28th, 1861. Missouri's secession convention convenes, and they too will vote, again, they're a border state, they too will vote against secession by a pretty large margin, 98-1. So all the border states, Tennessee, Virginia, now Missouri, are voting against even having a secession convention, let alone secession itself. That will change after the Battle of Fort Sumter. You have North Carolina's referendum on having the secession convention, where the people reject to even have a secession convention. Here's yet another border state. So that's 4 border states in a row. The Corwin Amendment will pass the House. The vote is 133 to 65. The Corwin Amendment is an amendment for the Constitution to not even be amended to abolish slavery. Now, it passes the House. It will not be ratified by the states. You have the Confederate Constitutional Convention. This is where the newly formed CSA will establish a constitution. And I have that on the timeline. You have Buchanan's message to Congress on security in D.C. for Lincoln's inauguration. So Lincoln, he's not even inaugurated yet. And yet you have a bunch of states, 7 states, secede, and there is a lot of concern about security in D.C. for the inauguration. You have the Nevada-Dakota Territorial Act, which will establish the territories of Nevada and Dakota. You have the Corwin Amendment, which will pass Congress, passes the Senate by a vote of 24-12. It does not get ratified by the states, however, and certainly not in time for the Civil War. You have the Morrill Tariff. This is something that Southerners did complain about, but if you look at all of the secession declarations, they never mention it. It's just about slavery. You have Arkansas's secession convention, which will convene, and they will vote against secession by 39 to 35, pretty close, but not yet in favor of secession. And again, Arkansas is, it's not really a border state, but it's pretty close to the border, at least out west. Now you finally get Lincoln's first inaugural address. And so here's an actual image of Lincoln's inaugural address. The Capitol building is still being built. It only started being built, I think, during Fillmore or Pierce's administration. And so it's only been about a decade since the construction of the extension of the Capitol began. So the dome isn't even completed, and many parts of the wings are not done. And after Lincoln gives his inaugural address, the Confederacy will make and pass their own constitution. Georgia adopts its new state Confederate Constitution March 16th, 1861. Arkansas's resolutions of grievances, so they don't vote for secession, but they do pass a resolution of grievances for the Union. And they're going to be complaining about the issue of slavery and also the issue of the Union not treating certain states as equals in Congress. You have the Constitution of Alabama. This is the Confederate Constitution of Alabama. Alexander Stephens will give his infamous Cornerstone Address on March 21st, 1861. In it, he says that the cornerstone of the Confederacy consists of white supremacy and also slavery. So the cornerstone is twofold: white supremacy and slavery, according to Alexander Stephens. Alabama adopts its new Confederate Constitution on March 21st, 1861. Louisiana will adopt its own Confederate Constitution, also on March 21st. Texas will do the same on March 23rd. The Morrill Tariff will go into effect on April 1st, 1861. South Carolina adopts its new state constitution, its Confederate Constitution. Now on April 12th to the 13th, you have the Battle of Fort Sumter. So after South Carolina seceded, Confederate leaders demanded that the United States abandon Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, seeing its continued occupation as a denial of their claimed independence. While Presidents James Buchanan and later Abraham Lincoln refused to surrender it because doing so would recognize secession and weaken federal authority, when Lincoln attempted to send food to the starving garrison, Confederate forces under PJT Beauregard opened fire on April 12th, 1861, forcing Major Robert Anderson to surrender after 34 hours. Although only 2 Union soldiers died in an accidental explosion during evacuation, the battle triggered Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers and turned the secession crisis into the American Civil War. So you have Lincoln's proclamation calling for the militia. So he's calling for 75,000 volunteers in order to quell the rebellion and to protect federal forts like Fort Sumter that is being attacked by southern states that have seceded from the Union. Virginia will have its secession ordinance. The convention votes 88 to 55. And you'll know this is the second time Virginia is voting on secession. The first time they voted against secession. Now they vote for it. Only after Lincoln's response to Fort Sumter. So you had 7 states that seceded before Fort Sumter. That is the heart of the Confederacy. And now you have several more states that will secede following Fort Sumter. Lincoln will give a proclamation to blockade rebel states. The blockade will include Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, and Texas. New York volunteers march down Broadway. The 7th Regiment of New York Volunteers marching on Broadway on their way to Pennsylvania Station and on to Washington, D.C., beginning April 19th, 1861. While Union volunteers are moving their way down south, a unit going through Baltimore will be harassed by Baltimore citizens. And so that Baltimore is in Maryland. Maryland is a slave-holding state, but it's north of D.C. So although it supports slavery, it's deep in Union territory. And so as the Union marches through Maryland on their way to South Carolina and Virginia, there is a riot that happens in Baltimore, which shows you some of the division in the North, or at least in the Union surrounding D.C. Florida will adopt its Confederate Constitution April 22nd, 1861. Lincoln will order its Lincoln will order General Scott to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. This would be very controversial for Lincoln's administration. A lot of people, when they complain about Lincoln, they talk about the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. There is some clarification that is needed. Lincoln only authorized Winfield Scott to do the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, and only along military supply lines and communication between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. So this is not a complete suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in the entire country. This is only giving one general the right to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in a very small area, very limited area. It's not the states of Pennsylvania and Maryland. It's literally just the supply line, the train line, train tracks, and the communication lines between Philadelphia and D.C. That's it. So, does the president have a right to do this? I mean, not really, but at the same time, because of how limited this is and how Congress will approve of it, it's a little bit more debatable. So, tell me what your opinions are in the comments about Lincoln suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Lincoln will also give a proclamation to increase the Navy and the Army. So he made a proclamation before calling forth the militia and volunteers, and now he's making a proclamation to increase the proper professional Navy and Army. Arkansas, another border state that rejected secession, will now be in favor of secession. North Carolina's secession ordinance. North Carolina is yet another border state, or near border state, that rejected secession and now are in favor of secession. Slaves Frank Baker, James Townsend. Slaves Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory escaped Confederate lines. These three men escaped the Confederate lines after having been forced to build rebel fortifications and rode across Hampton Roads to Union lines at Fortress Monroe, Virginia, commanded by General Butler. Union General Butler declared the three escaped slaves as contraband. General Butler did not want to return the slaves, which he would be enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, but he did not have the unilateral authority to free slaves. So what did he do? He declared that the fugitive slaves were contraband for being used by the Confederacy to build fortifications against the Union. This effectively freed the men from slavery and influenced other Union generals to do the same. So, before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, before any law revoking or repealing the Fugitive Slave Act, Union generals on their own are doing whatever they can to free slaves. And this is before any battle, right? This is after Fort Sumter, but Fort Sumter wasn't really a battle. This is before the Battle of Manassas. You have Ex parte Merryman, where Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, sitting as the circuit judge, not the full Supreme Court. He is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but in this case, he is just sitting as a circuit judge, ruled against Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Facts: John Merryman, a Maryland militia officer, was arrested for alleged Confederate activity. He was detained under Lincoln's April 1861 suspension of habeas corpus. His lawyers petitioned for release via habeas corpus. Taney held that only Congress, not the president, has the constitutional authority to suspend habeas corpus, based on Article 1, Section 9. Lincoln's unilateral suspension was therefore unconstitutional, and that Merryman must be released immediately. So another thing is, Merryman is a military officer, and the president does have unique jurisdiction when it comes to the arrest and trial of military personnel. So does the writ of habeas corpus, apply to the martial courts? That's a question. Obviously, Chief Justice Taney is very biased. He's the one who gives the Dred Scott decision, and he is very much on the side of the South, and so he does not want Lincoln to have power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus outside of Congress in order to arrest alleged Confederate sympathizers. So there's also that to take into consideration. Stephen Douglas, he is one of the candidates who ran against Lincoln, and not just in the presidential election, but years before in the Senate election in Illinois. So he is a Northern Democrat. He ran against Lincoln. He lost the presidential election against Lincoln and two other people. He will actually die during the secession crisis, and he dies while promoting the Lincoln administration. So he's promoting Lincoln, and that's when he dies. So, kind of sad. And then you have Tennessee. Again, Tennessee was a border state that rejected secession, and now they are in favor of secession. And while the South is seceding from the Union, some western counties of Virginia break away from the state to form West Virginia. So while the South is seceding, West Virginia is seceding as well. And this will conclude the first section of this chapter. The next section, called Preserving the Union from 1861 to 1863, will focus on the first couple years of the fighting. So while publicly insisting the war was fought to restore constitutional government, Lincoln and congressional Republicans advanced anti-slavery policy through the Confiscation Acts, compensated emancipation in Washington, D.C., the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act, and legislation banning slavery in the federal territories. At the same time, the Union pursued a grand strategy centered on the Anaconda Plan, blocking the Confederacy, seizing control of Mississippi River, and applying relentless pressure through large-scale armies, while brutal battles at Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg revealed the war's true scale, with 200,000 soldiers from both sides dead by the start of 1863. Confederate strategy was one of active defense, holding Southern territory while launching selective offenses, such as Lee's Maryland campaign, to disrupt Union plans, secure supplies, and weaken Northern resolve. The Union's tactical stalemate at Antietam halted Lee's invasion of the North and gave Lincoln the political and diplomatic opening he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. By 1863, preservation of the Union and the destruction of slavery had fused into a single war aim, demonstrating that emancipation was not a sudden turn, but the culmination of a strategy unfolding from the war's onset. So Lincoln, on July 4th, will make a speech to Congress, which people call it Lincoln's Call to Arms, and in it he's calling for even more volunteers in order to fight against the Confederates. And he will sign an act about increasing the size of the military. You have the very first battle, the Battle of Manassas, also known as Bull Run, is on July 21st, 1861. You have the War Aims Resolution. This talked about preserving the Union and restoring the federal government's authority within the seceded states and to bring those seceded states back into the Union. This specific resolution does not mention slavery. You have an act to suppress the rebellion by Congress. You have the Income Tax Act. This is a limited income tax on the wealthy in order to raise revenue for the war effort for the Union. Now you have the first Confiscation Act. This is the first act in which allowed the Union to confiscate slaves from the rebel states. So this is the first instance of the Union attacking slavery during the Civil War. And this is right at the beginning of the war. The Battle of Manassas happens on July 21st, 1861. The first Confiscation Act is on August 6, 1861. So just a couple months after the very first battle, and Congress is attacking slavery. The Battle of Wilson's Creek. I mostly focus on the politics of the Civil War and not necessarily the battles themselves. I do mention the battles, but we're not focusing on the battles. We're focusing on the politics of war. You have Lincoln's proclamation banning trade with rebellious states. This is part of the broader Anaconda Plan to completely blockade the South from trading, from commerce with any nation, including the Union. You have John C. Fremont's proclamation of emancipation. So again, pretty early on in the war, just a couple months after the first battle, you have Union generals who are taking their own actions to abolish slavery. And so John C. Fremont, who was actually the first presidential candidate of the Republican Party 4 years prior, is commanding the Union's Western Department, and he issues this proclamation in Missouri declaring martial law and stating that the slaves of disloyal Confederate owners were free. Now, Lincoln will push back against Fremont, telling Fremont that he does not have the authority to abolish slavery. Fremont will respond to Lincoln's response, basically telling him to stick it, and then Lincoln will give an executive order specifically for Fremont to not continue the emancipation of slaves. Not because Lincoln disagreed with the policy, but as Lincoln describes in this order, Lincoln does not believe that Fremont has the authority to unilaterally free slaves. Lincoln doesn't even believe that he, as president, has the unilateral authority to free slaves. Only Congress can do that. This is what Lincoln will be arguing against Fremont about. We have the first transcontinental telegraph from Sacramento, California to Lincoln in Washington, D.C. So that's kind of cool fact. While the war is going on, they're still building infrastructure for communication, and that's actually going to be a very helpful tool for Lincoln, which is the telegraph. You have the secessionist faction in Missouri will make its own secession ordinance. Missouri will not fully secede from the Union, but there will be a faction within Missouri that will fight for secession. McClellan will be named commanding general of the Union Army. You have Kentucky, a border state, will make its own secession ordinance, November of 1861. And here is Lincoln's 1861 State of the Union. Senator Wilson will introduce a bill to emancipate slaves in D.C. This is still 1861, guys. This is the first couple months of the war. The first 6 months of the war, if you start at Lincoln's call to arms in July of 1861 until December. And yet, slavery is the key issue leading up to the Civil War, and it's the key issue during the Civil War. So don't let anyone ever tell you that the war wasn't about slavery. Every single policy is surrounding slavery. John Tyler, he was a former U.S. president, and he turned Confederate, and he will die on January 18th, 1862, as a Confederate. You have the first general order of Lincoln, which is to give an advance to his Union Army. You had the Battle of Fort Donelson in February of 1862. You have executive order releasing prisoners. This is something that Lincoln will do throughout most of the Civil War. He will show clemency and pardon many prisoners, even while the Civil War is going on. So all you Southerners who think that Lincoln is a tyrant, during the war, he is freeing prisoners. So, not a very tyrant thing to do. Lincoln's son, Willie, dies at the White House at the age of 11 on February 20th, 1862. So while all that stuff is going on, the Civil War, trying to abolish slavery, his own son dies in the White House. You have the Battle of Island Number 10, also in February. Battle of Pea Ridge. Lincoln's message proposing compensated emancipation. So again, still pretty early on in the war, and Lincoln and many Republicans are fighting for the emancipation of slavery. And so Lincoln will give this message proposing the compensated emancipation. You have the Monitor versus Merrimack. You have the act prohibiting the return of fugitive slaves. So this act will repeal the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, an act that Lincoln absolutely hated ever since it first came out. First was approved in 1850, so 12 years before this. And again, still early on in the war, and Lincoln is focusing his politics on abolishing slavery. He proposes compensated emancipation, and he gets to repeal the Fugitive Slave Act. You have the Battle of Glorieta Pass. You have the infamous Battle of Shiloh, the worst single day of fighting. Was that Shiloh? Congress pledges aid to states that emancipate slaves. Here's another policy by Abraham Lincoln regarding slavery. At Lincoln's request, Congress pledges financial aid to any state that undertakes gradual emancipation with compensation to owners. You have an act to compensate emancipation of slaves in Washington, D.C. So the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act, signed into law by Lincoln on April 16th, 1860. That's supposed to be 62, not 61, freed over 3,000 enslaved people in Washington, D.C., while providing loyal slaveholders compensation up to $300 per person, and marked the first instance of federal government abolishing slavery, setting a precedent for emancipation policies during the Civil War and shifting the capital into a symbol of freedom for formerly enslaved people. You have the Battle of Forts Jackson and St. Phillips happening in mid to late April. You have the Siege of Corinth. General Hunter declares all slaves free in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. This is a Union general. He's making this declaration prematurely, and he's declaring that slaves are free. So it's really the generals who are pushing the abolition of slavery pretty early on. Lincoln is too, but the generals under Lincoln are kind of jumping the gun. You have Fremont, you have Butler, and now you have Hunter, who are just on their own fruition declaring emancipation. Lincoln will make a proclamation ending the blockade of several ports. Again, such a evil tyrant, Lincoln is actually ending blockades during the war, which kind of undermines the Anaconda Plan. Lincoln's proclamation encouraging the emancipation in border states. President Lincoln issues a proclamation urging the border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, to embrace gradual compensated emancipation. So again, while the war's going on, Lincoln is doing all these steps to get emancipation established and get that policy up and running while the war is going on. Again, this is still pretty early on in the war. Here's the Homestead Act. This gave a pretty large amount of land to families to farm, and if you can improve the land that you were granted, then you got to keep the land. So it's like loaning people land, and then if they improved it by either farming or being productive on it, then they got to keep the land. So this encouraged more westward settlers to go west. You have the executive order taking possession of the railroads, and so Lincoln is now seizing the railroads from private companies to be used and operated by the Union. General Robert E. Lee becomes the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia on June 1st, 1862. You have slavery prohibited in U.S. territories. This is another policy that Lincoln, for over a decade at this point, was in support of. He always believed that the federal government, and I believe he's right to believe this, that the federal government always had the right to abolish slavery in the federal territories. Now, this is true, just legally speaking. The federal government, even before the Constitution was ratified, had always abolished slavery in federal territories, going all the way back to the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, written by Thomas Jefferson. So Lincoln is just continuing or bringing back the idea that the federal government could abolish slavery in federal territories. Now, there was a decision just a couple years prior to this called the Dred Scott decision. It was a Supreme Court decision where Chief Justice Taney argued that the federal government did not have the right to abolish slavery in the U.S. territories. And Lincoln spoke out against that decision when it came out, and now he gets to basically overturn that decision completely. You have the Pacific Railway Act to create more rail lines. You have the Morrill Land Grant Act, which is to support the Homestead Act. You have the act prescribing an oath of office, and then this oath of office included a clause about how the individual who was about to take office was never a Confederate or someone who rebelled against the United States. You have a message proposing the Second Confiscation Act. So Lincoln is now proposing an amendment to the First Confiscation Act, which was passed all the way at the beginning of the war, all the way, let's see, back here in August of 1861. So now it's July 1862, and Lincoln is proposing an expansion of the First Confiscation Act. And what the Confiscation Act does, it allows military generals, the Union generals, to seize any and all slaves of Confederate masters and free them, to confiscate them as contraband being used against the Union. So that's the legal argument that Lincoln will use, and thousands of slaves will be freed before the Emancipation Proclamation by this policy. You have Lincoln's appeal for compensated emancipation in border states, and so he's still trying to get border states to appeal to adopt the gradual emancipation. Pension Act of 1862. This is to help encourage more enlistment by giving higher pensions for veterans. The Second Confiscation Act is passed on July 17th, 1862, where it frees the slaves of persons engaged in or assisting the rebellion. You have the amendment to the act calling forth the militia. This will allow black soldiers into the Union Army. And on July 22nd, 1862, so still pretty early on in the war, Lincoln will share a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. And the cabinet members, like Seward, just waiting until the Union military had a major victory before making the Emancipation Proclamation public. So Lincoln wanted, halfway into 1862, just a year after his, if I go back, it's only been 1 year since his call to arms. And yet, here he is proposing the Emancipation Proclamation. It's been 1 year. That's it. So don't let anyone tell you that the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. It was absolutely fought about slavery, and Lincoln was pretty much leading, at least in the federal government, he was leading emancipation with all these different steps. So it's not something that happens overnight, but it is something that is continually being worked on by Lincoln. Martin Van Buren, a former U.S. president, dies in New York. You have the start of the Dakota War, where eventually over 600 settlers and soldiers died, as well as 75 to 100 Dakota. You have the Prayer of 20 Millions by Horace Greeley. This is an open letter urging Abraham Lincoln to enforce existing anti-slavery laws and adopt emancipation as a central war aim, arguing that hesitation towards slavery was undermining the Union cause. It reflects growing Northern pressure to transform the Civil War into a moral and military struggle against slavery, helping set the stage for Lincoln's shift toward the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, a lot of people will reference this document right here, which is Lincoln's response to Horace Greeley, where he says that, if he can save the Union without freeing any slave, that he would do that. So a lot of people cherry pick that and be like, oh, Lincoln is not in favor of abolition. He doesn't care about abolishing slavery. Well, given everything that I showed you up to this point, Lincoln is very much in favor of abolition of slavery, of emancipation. And the public didn't know, at least when it comes to specifically the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Lincoln is kind of being coy here, saying, oh, well, if the Union could be preserved without saving a single slave, or saving some slaves but not others, that he would do that. But Lincoln, he does a complete 180 at the end of this letter, where he says that he has a personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. So anyone who uses this document and is like, oh, Lincoln is not an abolitionist, obviously did not read this document, at least not the full text of it. They're cherry picking a few lines of this document. If you read the entire thing, and if you have all the context of the fact that Lincoln proposed the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet a month before this document, and all the other steps, like repealing the Fugitive Slave Act, or having emancipated slaves in D.C., or banning slavery in federal territories, or number of speeches promoting gradual emancipation in the states, especially border states, it's kind of hard to argue that Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist, right? Given all that context and the full text of this document, I think it's impossible to argue that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He absolutely was. He is the great emancipator. And he needs some more respect regarding that. You have the Second Battle of Manassas, which happens in Virginia. You have the infamous Battle of Antietam. I made a mistake saying that Shiloh was the worst single day of fighting. It's actually Antietam. That's the worst single day of fighting. You have Lincoln's proclamation on the war aims and emancipation. And so it is in September 22nd, 1862, when Lincoln officially makes a proclamation talking about emancipation being a war aim. And so a lot of people say it's the start of 1863. It's actually a couple months before then when he announces the Emancipation Proclamation, but the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't go into effect until the first day of the first month of 1863. So that's why some people get that confused. Lincoln will expand the suspension of habeas corpus, and this will be nationwide. So the first one was very limited. It was just between D.C. and Philadelphia, and it was just the train lines and communication lines, and he only gave one general the right to suspend habeas corpus in order to get saboteurs. With this one, he extends this to be nationwide. And this one, I have a problem with. I don't think that the president has a right to suspend habeas corpus. I do think he has a right within the armed forces for specific military personnel and for, martial courts that he could issue a suspension of habeas corpus, which is what the first suspension did. But with this one, the second one, where it's nationwide, and this involved draft resistance, disloyal activity, and the aid to the Confederacy. As much as I hate the Confederacy, I don't think that the president has unilateral authority to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Only Congress has the right to do that. Although Congress will be giving a permission after the fact to Lincoln to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Here's Lincoln's 1862 State of the Union, which he gives in December. He had the Battle of Fredericksburg in December. That's Fredericksburg, Virginia. You have Lincoln's message to the Senate on the Dakota War. You have Jefferson Davis' proclamation remanding to state authorities. Remanding to state authorities black Union soldiers captured. So Confederate President Davis, that's Jefferson Davis, issues proclamation ordering that black Union soldiers and their officers captured by Confederate troops are not to be treated as prisoners of war. Instead, they are to be remanded to Confederate state authorities, that is, to become slaves again. So you have an act to admit West Virginia. So West Virginia seceded from Virginia, and now they are a state. And of course, the very last document of this section is the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Civil War up to this point is culminating to the Emancipation Proclamation, which was already announced all the way back in September of 1862, but it doesn't go into effect until January 1st, 1863. And this will go into the third and final section of this chapter, which will cover the last two wars of the war, or last 2 years of the war. So you have the Battle of Arkansas Post. You have the Mud March, where Burnside's will he tries to outflank Robert E. Lee, but heavy rains turns the roads impassable as wagons sink and troops are slowed. Burnside, because of this failure to outflank Robert E. Lee, Burnside gets sacked by Lincoln, and he's replaced by General Hooker. And so General Joseph Hooker replaces Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac, improving morale and organization of Union forces, although he will not get, he won't last very long either. You have the territorial government of Arizona. So Arizona's about to become a state. You have the National Banking Act to stabilize the finances during the Civil War. You have the temporary territorial government of Idaho. You have the 1863 Enrollment Act, which is the draft to get more Union soldiers. An act incorporating National Academy of Sciences. Kind of cool. And now you have the official congressional approval for Lincoln to suspend the habeas corpus. So Lincoln's already suspended habeas corpus, but now Congress is giving its approval. And so this authorizes the President of the United States to suspend the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, allowing military authorities to detain individuals suspected of aiding the Confederacy without immediate judicial review. It was passed under the administration of Abraham Lincoln, formalizing earlier unilateral suspensions he had already ordered in response to rebellion and internal unrest. The act also provided limited protections by requiring federal courts to issue lists of detained individuals and mandated eventual review or release, but it significantly expanded executive and military detention powers during the war. You have the American Freedmen Commission appointed. American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission appointed by Secretary of War Stanton to investigate the condition of former slaves and recommend measures for their employment and welfare. So again, Civil War is still going on, and the Union is still, is nevertheless preparing for after the war, how are we going to take care of all these former slaves? You have a proclamation for admitting West Virginia by Lincoln. We have the Labor Code, or General Orders 100, which is a military order by Francis Lieber. You have the Battle of Chancellorsville in April of 1863. You have the Battle of Vicksburg, where Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton surrounded the city and over 29,000 troops to Union Major General Ulysses S. Grant after a 47-day siege. This pivotal Union victory, coinciding with the aftermath of Gettysburg, split the Confederacy in two by giving the Union full control of the Mississippi River. So this is a very important Grant victory. While that battle is going on, that siege, you have military order to organize colored troops. So now colored troops, black soldiers, will be given their own units. You have the failed assault on Port Hudson, Louisiana, where black soldiers play an important role in the failed assault on Port Hudson, Louisiana. You have the Kabahi Ferry Raid, where Harriet Tubman works with the Union Army as a scout and spy, and she aids in the Kabahi Ferry Raid in South Carolina, helping liberate 700 slaves in the month, in just these couple of days in June. So while Vicksburg's siege is dying down, you have the Battle of Gettysburg in early July of 1863. And while shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, which is the largest battle of the war, you have this very famous picture. It's called the Scourge Back, and it's photographed and published in Harper's Weekly, which is the most read newspaper in the country during the Civil War. And that photograph became public on July 4th, 1863. The Union will have a victory at Port Hudson, and the Confederate surrender of Port Hudson clinches Union control over the Mississippi River. So you have Union victory after Union victory. Excuse me. While all that is going on, you have the New York City draft riots of mid-July, and they're rioting against the Enrollment Act, which is the draft. And it's mostly Irish immigrants who just got here and they don't want to be drafted and forced to fight in a war. You have an executive order on equal retaliation of war crimes. So Lincoln pledges that Union soldiers, black or white, are entitled to equal protection if captured by the enemy, and threatens retaliation for Confederate enslavement of black prisoners of war. You have Lincoln's letter to Conkling on emancipation, where he talks about the eventual emancipation in the North as well. You have Lincoln's proclamation suspending the writ of habeas corpus. This is the third time that Lincoln will suspend habeas corpus, this time expanding it beyond what the first two suspensions included. You have a proclamation calling for 300,000 more volunteers to fight for the Union. And Lincoln will give his Gettysburg Address on November 19th, 1863, months after the Battle of Gettysburg. And this is a very famous address by Lincoln. And so, in honor of Lincoln, I'm actually going to quickly read the full address. It should only take me like 2 minutes. So this is Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which he gave on November 19th, 1863. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they fought here have thus so far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. An amazing address by Abraham Lincoln. Very short, very sweet, to the point, and amazing. And so that I think every American should read every year. Maybe for Thanksgiving, since it happens in November. They have Lincoln's 1863 State of the Union address. Talks about the course of the war so far and the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation. And now you have an interesting note. Lincoln is now thinking about Reconstruction. And so, December 8th, 1863, Lincoln gives a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, where he talks about showing amnesty by giving pardon to many Confederates. Ooh, such a tyrant. He's pardoning all of his enemies. Such a tyrant. And he's planning for a reconstruction of how he will envision a post-slavery United States. So, in many respects, this is the start of Reconstruction while the war is still going on. You have Senator John B. Henderson. He proposes the 13th Amendment. So, yes, the 13th Amendment gets started under the Lincoln administration. A lot of people say, oh, well, the 13th Amendment was passed after Lincoln died, so Lincoln had nothing to do with it. No, Lincoln had a lot to do with the 13th Amendment. A lot to do with it. You have the amending and the act for enrolling and calling out the national forces. That's about the draft. General Grant named the commanding general of the Union, so he replaces Hooker, who himself replaced Burnside. You have the Constitution of Arkansas. This is the 1864 Constitution, and it abolishes slavery and supported by pro-union voters. You have the admission of Nevada as a free state. You have a proclamation of amnesty. This is the first proclamation. I guess it's the second official proclamation of amnesty by Lincoln. Lincoln's letter to Hodges on his thoughts on emancipation. Again, he's talking about how emancipation is needed in order to completely end this war. The Senate will pass the 13th Amendment on April 8th, 1864. You have the massacre at Fort Pillow. Confederate troops under General Nathan B. Forrest massacre black soldiers captured at the fort in Tennessee. So this is a major war crime against black soldiers. You have Lincoln's speech at Sanitary Fair in Baltimore. Executive order for the arrest and imprisonment of irresponsible newspaper reporters and editors. This is something that I don't necessarily agree with Lincoln on. Arresting newspaper reporters. Now, the newspaper reporters were lying about the war, so there is that, but should Lincoln have gone so far as to arrest them? That's a different question, and I don't necessarily agree with Lincoln. As much of a Lincolnite as I am, there are some policies that I think Lincoln probably shouldn't have done. You have the Organic Act of Montana. This is to prepare Montana as a state. You have the Union National Convention to nominate Lincoln. Abolition fails in the House, and so the 13th Amendment will it pass the Senate. It has yet to pass the House. You have an equal pay for black soldiers. Lincoln's speech at Sanitary Fair in Philadelphia. You have an act to officially repeal the Fugitive Slave Act. Lincoln accepts his nomination for president. You have the Wade-Davis Bill. Lincoln's pocket veto of the Wade-Davis Bill. Proclamation declaring martial law and the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in Kentucky. So here's another suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, this time focusing on a border state. You have Lincoln's message of his pocket veto of the Wade-Davis Bill. Proclamation calling for 500,000 more volunteers on top of the hundreds of thousands that he had already called upon. Battle of Mobile Bay, August of 1864. Lincoln's interview with John Mills about the course of the war. Excuse me. You have General Sherman. He seizes Atlanta in September of 1864. Lincoln will congratulate Sherman on doing so. Louisiana State Constitution of 1864 abolished slavery, and it's backed by pro-union voters. You have Maryland, which is, they will pass their own constitution, which abolishes slavery. Takes effect in November of 1864. You have the election of Lincoln, and here's a video by Mr. Beat. He is a history YouTuber, and he made a bunch of these videos on the elections that we have on our compendium. So check out and subscribe to his channel if you like the content that he makes. I like him. In November, you have the burning of Atlanta. So this is the start of Sherman's march to the sea. And I live near Atlanta, so I see these history plaques all over the place because I'm right in the path of Sherman's march. And that begins on November 11th, 1864, starting at Atlanta, and then he cuts across Georgia all the way to the sea. Let's see. Lincoln's 1864 State of the Union. Chase swears in as Chief Justice. The proclamation calling for 300,000 more volunteers. Missouri State Constitution of 1865, which abolishes slavery. Sherman's order in Georgia giving land to freed men. And so he issues an order where any abandoned land will be given to former slaves. And so this is where you get the 40 acres and a mule. It was originally just 40 acres to freed slaves, and it was a military order given by Sherman, although that will not become official policy. What the Black Man Wants is a speech given by Frederick Douglass. I need to find the link to it so I can add it to the timeline. Congress, specifically the House, finally approves of the 1865, January 31st, 1865, 13th Amendment. It's finally proposed by Congress to the states. You have the Hampton Roads Peace Conference, where Abraham Lincoln will meet the leaders of the Confederacy, like Alexander Stephens, to talk about peace, although no peace agreement can be made. Excuse me. You have the Tennessee State Constitution of 1865, which abolishes slavery. Freedmen's Bureau established. Congress establishes the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau, to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom. Joint resolution liberating wives and children of black soldiers. So Congress approves a joint resolution liberating the wives and children of black soldiers ahead of the 13th Amendment, by the way. Then you have Lincoln's second inaugural address. Here's an image of Lincoln. And some people believe that this guy right here is John Wilkes Booth. I don't know how we can verify that. I mean, it kind of looks like him, but I don't know. I don't know how we can verify him. You have the Proclamation of Pardon to Deserters by Abraham Lincoln. Executive order arresting those who trade with rebel states. Executive order for the arrest of those giving arms to hostile natives. So you have, conflict with Native Americans going on, like the aforementioned Dakota War. You have an address on the rebel states forcing slaves to fight. And so this is an address by Lincoln talking about how the rebel states are forcing the slaves to fight. You have the executive order to raise the flag at Fort Sumter. Now that the Union has taken back the fort at the end of the war, you have the Potomac's campaign. Union troops occupy Petersburg and Richmond. So the war is quickly dying down as the South are losing more and more battles and territory. And this is the last campaign of the South, of a united Southern army led by Robert E. Lee. And so during this time, Lincoln will actually go to Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy before the Union took it. And this, on April 9th, 1865, is when Lee surrenders to Grant. So here's a nice painting of that. You have Abraham Lincoln's final public address on April 11th. On April 12th, the Army of Northern Virginia is disbanded. And on April 14th at 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth will shoot Abraham Lincoln. And at 7:22 a.m. the next morning, April 15th, Abraham Lincoln will pass away. And this is the very last event that I have on this timeline. It's the last event that I have for this entire chapter. So, thank you for watching. If you want to access this website, this page that I'm on, that I just showed you, you can go to our website at www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us. This is chapter 13, called Civil War. And it's best viewed on desktop and laptop, by the way. And yeah, it's free to access. You don't need special permission to access it. There's no paywall, no advertisements or anything like that on my site. And yeah, it's a free resource for anyone who wants to study American history and get access to primary documents. So check it out. We are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3. And so if you want to contribute, to donate, you can do so, and that is tax deductible. So thank you again for watching today's live stream if you were here. And I hope you join me tomorrow where I talk about chapter 14, which will be another long chapter because I will go over Reconstruction. And I have many documents and events for Reconstruction. So thank you for watching. I hope you learned something new of our old history. And I hope to see you tomorrow. All right. Have a nice day.